Continuing my journey through the 2010s in country music, I have stumbled upon Maren Morris' Girl. Now, this is an interesting album to talk about. On my initial listen to this album, I thought, I don't really like this album. At all. On my second listen, I thought, hey, this isn't as bad as I thought it was. And as I kept listening over and over, this album started to show its true colors of great intellectualism. But that's not to say this album had some really rotten moments, which we'll get into. But comparing this to merely bland albums really showed me the level of artistry, or more so, artistic potential Maren Morris had. And to really sum it up, I'm still not the biggest fan of this album. I still think it's clearly misidentified as country and leans more into modern pop and R&B. I think it's still in a flux between good and bad. But before I get into this album deeply, to all the Morgan Wallen stans listening, if you happen to stumble upon this video, oh no, he's reviewing the album of the woman who bashed him. Somebody calls a wambulance. Let me play you a sad song on the world's tiniest violin. It's my channel, I can do whatever I want. So with that tiny disclaimer out of the way, let's dive in. In some of my previous videos, I've described sophomore albums really in two categories. Either you surpass your debut and go on to do great things, or fail and fall into irrelevancy. And once again, similar to Desperate Man, it's not really either of the two. This album did pretty well, especially with some of the singles, but praise-wise, it didn't garner much attention. Sure, it won Album of the Year at the CMA Awards, but after that, what else did this record receive in terms of critical praise? A lot of hate really comes from two things. A, her winning Album of the Year despite being the most blatant pop album in years, and B, a bunch of crybabies who can't handle criticism. Now personally, yeah, I think Desperate Man should have won. It was a far better album, but besides that, look at her competition. Centerpoint Road. Once again, we have a pop album disguising itself as country, but this was far worse. The same would go for Cry Pretty. Both of these are some of the cheapest attempts at pop I've ever seen. At least with Maren, she went all the way. As for Dan and Shay's self-titled, that's a bit of an interesting one. I think overall it had a lot more bangers, but in terms of lyrical maturity, I'd have to give this one to Girl. So while I didn't think it deserved the award over Eric Church, if Desperate Man wasn't nominated, I'd probably want the award to go to Girl. With that said, let's get into each introspective layer of this rich album. The album opens up with the self-titled track, Girl, and this is a bit of an interesting one to talk about. I think vocal-wise, she knocks it out of the park, like, wow, this is great, and it has some truly exceptional lines like, if vanity's my vitamin, well, I don't feel the difference. Or my personal favorite, I don't want to wear your crown, there's enough to go around. It's always perplexed me. It takes on a similar theme of pageant material where she wants to be who she is rather than this idolized figure on a pedestal. But after that, this song lost me. I think it loses its grasp on the theme of empowerment, like the moments where this song hit really hard, but it only happens a couple of times throughout it. It becomes repetitive and stops being subversive. Overall, it's good, but it really is a taste of empowerment rather than something that delves deep into it. This leads into the feels, and wow, this song is a jam and a half. The verses in this song just flow so naturally. Like, this is a good attempt at pop country. Just great job. You really nailed it on this one. I think it lacks a true bridge or any true clever moments, but I rarely see that in songs like this, so it's more of a nitpick rather than criticism. But still, more of this in terms of radio airplay, less this. Then we get into ironically my favorite track, All My Favorite People. What it lacks in writing, it makes up for in powerful vocal and instrumental delivery. It partners her up with Brothers Osborne, who absolutely kill it. Southern rock is where both of these guys thrive. Instrumentally, it just slaps. This must get people really riled up when it's performed live. If it actually talked about her favorite people, this song would be a lot higher in my personal opinion, but regardless, this song just rules. A Song for Everything has major I could use a love song vibes. You can argue it's a progression of that story. I love all the callbacks to songs like Eric Church's Springsteen, that's really neat. It's a jam with some truly clever writing. Mixtaped your heartbreak and made you feel holy, like, ooh, that's such a good line. And I think its message is pretty relatable. I hesitate to call it compelling, but despite our different tastes in music, music in the end, regardless of genre, can help us in ways medicine, friendships, or family never could. But then the album stops being clever and fun as we get into track 5. Now normally track 5s are the best or most mature track. That's not the case with this song. Common is probably my least favorite. It's not the worst this album has, but it takes absolutely no risks. The vocal performance is so boring, and it doesn't even go into what her and Brandi Carlile, the featured vocalist, have in common. And you could argue this is a song for unity, but I don't like those songs, so whichever road you take, I'll still have a negative opinion of it. Thankfully, after that nothing burger of a song, we get into the lively flavor, which actually delves into actual flavors in a fun way, unlike some other songs. It's a pretty solid blend of rock and pop. I will say it's a bit vague with its message. Is this supposed to be a fun food jam, an empowering song? I'm a bit confused as its message isn't properly put before me, but still, regardless of that, this song itself manages to stay afloat with how fun it is in every aspect. Then we apparently get into the side B of the album, opening with Make Out With Me. Now, I'm not the biggest fan of sex jams, so I'm not the biggest fan of this track. It's a clap track, so that puts salt on the wound. My problems with this song are more of a me thing. I can see people enjoying this. I do like the detail of getting takeout food, and I think it's a moment where you want the song to be story driven, and it's kind of just a copy and paste song, but one of the better ones. Gold Love is a weird one to say the least. It has everything I look for in Maren Morris, but a coherent story. The vocals are soulful, which is really where she thrives. I mean, look at My Church. This is a really well written song, but my biggest issue is that none of the lines really correlate per se. Like, all of the individual aspects are really well thought out, but they don't really connect. And missing a story, or at least an overall message, is probably the biggest thing in a song, so missing that can be disastrous. I'd put the great ones in the same category as well, some interesting details that don't really come together to form an overall message. And I think going in detail with who the great ones are could help a lot. But both of these songs still work despite their major shortcomings. But then we get into the absolute worst track of this album. RSVP is just so awful. It's basically Make Out With Me, but stripped of anything good it had going for it. Trap beats are not my thing, never have, never will. This song is overly repetitive, non-specific. I'm sure people are more open to this and it's more of a personal distaste, but I don't enjoy it, and labeling it country just makes it way worse. Now look, I've seen worse attempts at sex jams, sure, but that doesn't really justify this song's awfulness. Thankfully, there's a palate cleanser, To Hell and Back, which was her last single. It's roughly country-esque, I really enjoy the gloomy vibe it has, and it's such a unique concept for a song. It's the most perplexing of all the tracks. If I had to sum it up, there really isn't anything like it on the entire album. Also, hats off for pushing this song to radio. After The Bones, which was her most popular and mostly pop-oriented song, she could have just went with something like RSVP or The Feels, but instead she went with something more intellectual and country-like. Not many artists are willing to do that. Call her country or pop, she has good taste. I think I've been pretty expressive online with my opinion of The Bones. I don't really like this song, overall. Now, on one hand, this song is really well produced, it's actual pop done right, but once again, this is an extremely vague song with its messaging, and its popularity was really annoying to me, but at least it wasn't just Florida Georgia Line going #1 for 20 weeks again. Trust me, it's more common than you think. And The Bones provided a platform for a lot of female country artists to chart high again, and a lot of truly compelling women were in the spotlight after several years. So like I said in my pop country versus bro country video, the ends justify the means, I guess. Thankfully, the final two tracks are truly exceptional. Also, I find it funny that after an awful song, it's followed up by a really good one. Good Woman just has this beautiful orchestra accompaniment and has this great gloomy production style, which is really becoming Maren's signature style. Good Woman is basically saying, if you ever find yourself in a corner or a dark place, there will always be someone to pull you out of it and bring you back to reality. Everything finally comes back together with the track, a coherent story, message, and great details. Then the album closes with Shade, which is just a thrill of a ride, where she really just lets loose and shows off her powerful vocals. It's not overly pop, which a lot of this album can really be. I have a bit of trouble with what she means by shade, but regardless, this song is basically everything I love about Maren Morris. Thriving instrumentals, belting vocals, she accomplishes so much more than her mainstream counterparts. But after all of this discussion comes the big question. Do I consider this album good? Now look, I think there is a lot to enjoy with this album, but it's way too vague in so many aspects that it really overwhelms the entire project when looking at it in a more broader perspective. It can really frustrate me because the pieces are all here to make a truly exceptional record. There are plenty of exceptional songs, but so many critical misses as well. Plus, this album does really lack a core message. The closest I can put it to is her refusal to be on a pedestal and try to have a more normal life despite being one of the biggest stars in music. But even going there is a big stretch. It drops different storylines and underdeveloped scenes onto each other, and it eventually collapses. Now look, there are more good songs than boring or bad, but similar to how certain great lines and songs don't connect to form something truly compelling, the same could be applied with the songs and the album itself. And in the end, I just have really high standards for music these days. Younger me would have praised this album to no end. But after being exposed to even more compelling artists in both indie and mainstream, it's just really hard to get invested in this. And even then, just compared to a majority of her competition these days, I can name a few dozen albums of the past few years which are a complete train wreck, which makes me appreciate Girl even more. I think that's a good way to end things. Sure, Girl is a bit underbaked, but despite some pretty major issues, it manages to perplex me more than a majority of the mainstream output. Is it great? Nope. But is it awful like so many unbridled fanboys on the internet are saying? Absolutely not.